Hello and welcome to episode 25 of the Effective Faith podcast. It's a podcast answering questions about productivity, tools and gear that help us get things done, as well as thinking about theology, Christian living, and how to approach getting things done in a way that supports your overall well-being and helps us to honour Jesus better. My name's Chris Wood. I run Effective Faith and I'm your host for the podcast. Please do check out this podcast. It's available on YouTube and all of your favourite podcasting apps. Now, before we dive in today, I want to encourage you, if you value this, if you like it, then please do subscribe, leave a review on your app of choice. That really does help to get this podcast to be seen and heard by more people. And if you know of anyone for whom this particular episode might be helpful, then please do pass it on, please do share it. Today we're thinking about how you should read a book for all it's worth. Reading has value. I've argued this at length before, and if you're not convinced, then check out my blog posts, Why Can't I Focus? Or you could also have a look at a post called Read Books. It's an older post from the days when I thought the way to get people's attention was to put the post's title in all capital letters. You see, reading, it has value, both for the knowledge and wisdom that it gives you access to, but also for the ways in which it trains your concentration and it builds your skill at focusing. You might therefore have seen another blog post of mine, what books should Christians be reading? And you've read that and you'll now find yourself, book in hand, wanting to read the book. Here's the question. How should you read a book for maximum effectiveness? How should you read a book for all it's worth? You see, most of us can read, but it's that second part, isn't it, that eludes us, maximum effectiveness in our reading. You see, there have been plenty of times that I've read books, but I've done it in an ineffective way, and I've ended up gaining little benefit from the book on the first time I read it. You see, here's the point. I suspect that many people who would say, I don't read, well, we don't read because we get little value from the books that we read. They get little value from it because they read it in the wrong way. Therefore, they don't see the point in reading, and they're right. If you don't get value from the books that you're reading, then reading is a complete waste of time. So today, it's Reading 101. Back to basics. How should you read a book for all it's worth? Now, I'm not talking about fiction here. The best way to read fiction, we can all agree, is in the beachside cafe bar of the Barcelo Agua Marina in Calaferrera, Calador, with some kind of chilled, fruity drink, or possibly in a tub chair with a mug of coffee by the forward-facing panoramic windows of the Viking Crown Lounge on the splendour of the seas as the ship sails through the Greek Isles and the sun sets. That is indisputably the best way to read fiction. But let's get the basics out of the way as we approach non-fiction books. Number one, read intentionally. You see, this is all about consistency. It's really hard to gain value from a book if you read for 20 minutes one day and then a month later pick it up again to read the next bit. Now, it's well over a year since I started Tiago Forte's book, Building a Second Brain. For various reasons, none of it related to the actual book itself, my reading of this book has been really sporadic. So to maximise the benefit and the value that I get, I'm going to have to start the book again. Number two, try and read when and where you won't be distracted. Now, what that means is going to be fairly fluid, isn't it? You don't want to set requirements on your reading environment that are going to be hard to deliver. For example, only being able to read in the Viking Crown Lounge of a large cruise ship. You see, all I really mean by this is that you shouldn't try to read in situations where you necessarily will need to focus on something else, like whilst driving or whilst having a conversation with someone. You might also want to avoid reading books, on your phone unless you actually have no other choice, because this guy bleeps and blurps at you all the time, and if you're trying to read, that's just going to be a distraction. But then thirdly, following on from that, make the most of short snippets of time. You see, this is something I personally am really, really bad at, increasingly so. If you're reading consistently and reading effectively, then you don't need a solid hour block or more in order to read and get into a book. You can read a paragraph in the 5 minutes you have whilst waiting for a bus, for example. Many people do that. Your aim in reading is going to have a massive impact on how you do it. You see, the aim in reading a non-fiction book, I would argue, is to gain wisdom. Wisdom could be defined as positive applied knowledge. Knowledge that has some kind of beneficial impact on your life, your thinking, and the choices that you make day to day. Now, I was going to say something that transforms your life, but that sounds too grand. You see, it could just be a small change. But still, we read to gain wisdom. Now, understanding this is actually really important. There are many people out there who will make famous and grand claims to read a book a day, or something equally ridiculous. That's not your aim. Your aim is not just to read books, but to gain wisdom. So you may claim that you've read 365 books in the past year, but of what value was that to you? Show me the wisdom that you've gained instead. Tell me what you've learned. Tell me how it's positively impacted you. I want to say additionally, we're not reading to gain knowledge. We read to gain wisdom. There's a difference. Reading for wisdom, it requires more time to think, to meditate, to dwell on, to process, to consider the implications and the applications of the things that we read. We're not reading to get through books. We're not reading to gain knowledge. We're reading to gain wisdom. And with that as our aim, the question is, how should you read a book for all it's worth? Or how should you read a book to mine it for as much wisdom as you possibly can? Now, currently, I have a 3-stage process for this. Part 1, read the book, 1 chapter at a time, and underline or highlight anything that resonates with me. That's what I do. If I'm reading on an e-book, this is much easier, and I may use a simple colour-coded highlight system, which would be 1 colour for most things I think are important to the logic and the argument of the book, and another colour for things that are especially applicable to me, and then maybe a 3rd colour for any quotes that I want to save for future reference. In physical books, I really don't like the idea of writing in them personally. Now, you'll find many people who argue that you must write in books. That's fine, but for me, my compromise is simply to underline in pencil anything that resonates or forms a key part of the argument or a key step in the logic. So I read the book, 1 chapter at a time, underlining or highlighting anything that resonates. Part 2. As I finish each chapter, I review it with my notes application open. This is currently UpNote. Here, I'll use the highlights that I've made to summarise the chapter, save any quotes, flag up any thoughts and ideas over the impact of this chapter and how I could apply the material. I'll flag up anything I disagree with and want to consider further, or questions that the material raises but doesn't fully answer. If the book comes with suggested study questions, which some do, now I may glance at these and use them if they're helpful. Now, this bit of the process normally takes around 20 to 30 minutes per chapter, and it is well worth it. And then finally, as I finish the book, I will set aside a chunk of time, maybe 30 minutes to an hour, depending on the book. I'll review my notes on each and every single chapter, quickly skim through the things I highlighted, and from this, I'll try and write a summary of the book. This would normally involve the logic of the book, step by step as I work through it, and would major on the impact that I think this book should have or needs to have on my own life and my own thinking. That's my 3-stage process. It's worth acknowledging that for some books this process is easy, and for others it is a lot harder. For some books, either because of linguistic differences due to the time period in which they were written or due to the complicated nature of the arguments being made, it requires a little bit of wrestling, a little bit of thought to actually summarise the book. Books that require this shouldn't be avoided for this reason alone. But it is worth acknowledging that, for example, a book like Pierced for Our Transgressions is going to require a bit more time and consideration than a book like Will You Be My Facebook Friend? You see, I like to consider the dwarves' experience here from Lord of the Rings. You see, some gold is found close to the surface and needs simply to be plucked out of the rock. The Arkenstone, however, required more work to gain. Now, I'm yet to unearth a bullrog in all of my reading, but there may be one out there, so beware. Now, having said all of that, I want to address a question or something that I hear a lot. Is skimming a good way to read books? You see, I want to touch on this before I finish, as I've come across so much material that basically makes the point that the way to read books properly is not to actually read them. Now, there are major advocates out there of skim reading books. They would say that there are far too many books that they need to read and get their heads around than they have time to sit down and actually read. Now, this is the subject of an AI-written tweet for the modern day, if there ever was one. Most of us would love to read more books and articles, but 95% of us are doing it wrong. You get the idea. The argument is that you don't have the time to sit down, you don't have the time to read every single word of a book, you don't have the time to actually read the book, and you don't know when you open a book if it's actually worth your investment of time. So, there are 2 good reasons why actually reading the whole book is not a good idea, they say. The third is the idea that you don't even need to read the whole book. You can understand the arguments and the point of a book without reading it by adopting a process of skim reading. Now, there are many different approaches to this that I've read about. The one I've heard most frequently is to get your head around the contents page, the flow of the book from chapter to chapter, then maybe read the first and the last paragraph of each chapter, which will normally introduce, conclude, and summarise what's written in it. And then from that, you can work out if any of the chapters are worth looking at in more depth. If you haven't fully understood the point of the chapter from the introduction and the conclusion, for example, or if the chapter looks like it covers a lot of ground that you don't already know. Thus, these people would say, you can understand the argument of the book, fill in any gaps in your own knowledge, and understand the author's approach to complicated ideas without ever reading the whole book. Therefore, once you have everything you need from the book, you can discard it and move on to the next book. I suspect that this is how many people who read 365 books a year actually get through that many. They don't actually read the books. This approach has always made me feel very uncomfortable. First, it seems a little arrogant to approach a book with an assumption that a lot of the content can be skipped over and the book still be understood. If you can read and understand the book without actually reading the book, then why did the author bother writing it? Second, we would argue that long-form material, such as books, is much better than the shorter stuff that's often produced today, the little snippets and summaries. But if we don't actually engage with a book as long-form writing, but merely look for the summaries at the beginning and the end of the chapters, then why not just read and write things in short-form summaries? Why bother going to the effort of writing books and reading books? And then lastly, and maybe this is a personality thing, it just feels plain wrong on 2 fronts. First, it's like coming and stripping the book for parts and discarding the rest. And second, I don't believe you can actually claim to have read a book if you haven't read the book without being dishonest and lying. Maybe that's a personality thing. I have an ally in this in the form of Charles Spurgeon. You may have heard of him. He once said this: a student will find that his mental constitution is more affected by one book thoroughly mastered than by 20 books which he's merely skimmed, lapping at them. The point here is simple and it's relevant to our topic. The more time you spend on a book, the more it impacts you. You might not gain more knowledge from it, but you might get greater wisdom, more of a change in your perspective, and a deeper impact on your heart and on your life. Reading is about more than just filling gaps in our knowledge so we've got more to say at parties. Reading's about shaping our mind, shaping our heart, and impacting our life. You see, I agree with Charles Spurgeon here. One book, thoroughly mastered, will have a greater impact on you than 20 books merely dipped into for whatever knowledge we can get from them in the shortest amount of time possible. Now, none of this is to say that getting the understanding of the structure and argument of a book is not helpful, but I see this as an aid to reading the book and not a substitute for it. At times, and for specific projects maybe, then I might not have the time to fully read and digest the book, so I may strip it for the parts I need. But I wouldn't claim to have read the book. This is something that I'm working through and I'm thinking through at the moment as I am trying to read quite a bit more. And I will share my thoughts on this as I go. But before I finish today, I've got one final thought for you. If you're reading my blog, if you're watching my videos, listening to my podcast, it may well be that you've sometimes considered writing your own material, especially long-form material. Then why not check out the process for reading books and reverse it to get a process for writing a book? Part 1. Write a summary of the book and the impact and the applications that you want it to have. Map out the logic to make that argument chapter by chapter. 2. Write a summary of and plan the logic out for each chapter, taking into account how this fits into the larger logic and argument of the book that you planned in step 1. Highlight any specific points that you want to make and any specific things that you want to say in each chapter. And then number 3, write the book, one chapter at a time. You might have only snatches of time here or there, but if the logic of each chapter is planned out, then in 20 minutes you could write a short section of your chapter, and in 5 minutes you could write a paragraph of it. And behold, you have a first draft. It's interesting, isn't it, how the process for writing a book is the process for reading a book in reverse. I just wanted to share that with you before we finish. As I said, if you found this valuable, please leave a review, please share the episode, the podcast. And I would love to have more questions from listeners, so drop me an email. It's effectivefaith15.58@gmail.com, or you can use the contact form on my website, effectivefaith.org. If you listen on Spotify, you should also be able to ask a question directly in the Q&A box that's available on Spotify on the episode. Thank you again for listening. And remember, you can be very productive without being very effective. In the context of today, you can read a lot of books, but get no value from them.